A very warm welcome to my community. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. As always, thanks for joining us. Generations of Barbadian children sang it with gusto and energy. Millie gone to Brazil. Was this fictitious? Was Millie a real person? Did she go to Brazil? Was she found in a well? Now, this week, as the spotlight falls on the community of Baxrock, our guest, Dr. Frederick Alling, will answer those questions and more. But as always, he begins by placing things in the correct perspective. Take it over, Doc.
Baxrock got its name from a 17th century landowner by the name of Lieutenant John Bax. The name is recorded in the 1775 Mayon map as an area here on the border of St. Michael, St. James. So that's how we got the name Baxrock, and of course we can see from the geographical features here, it's based on a little limestone cliff, and really the name is very much appropriate. In the 17th, 18th century, the area along what we now consider to be Baxrock Beach had a road that linked Upper Prospect, which is the area closest to the St. Michael border, and people could walk along this little road into Bridgetown. It connected at Fontainebleau into Bridgetown. So it seemed to be a regular path that Barbadians used back in the 17th and 18th century. So we continue to use the Baxrock Road, the old Baxrock Road, well into the 20th century. Most persons would remember turning in by Baxrock Road and coming down to the beach and enjoying themselves, having picnics and everything else, until in recent times a new road was laid that comes in off the road that takes us into a Black Rock just below the Lazaretto. And we can't speak of Baxrock unless, of course, we speak of some of the surrounding features. We have the Lazaretto just on the little hill opposite the Baxrock Beach. That was a hospice for persons who had leprosy. And so it was a hospital. And in later years, we know that complex as the Barbados Archives Department. It was also an area where they had a small military fortification. All the Barbadians remember Paradise Beach Hotel down here in the 1930s. One of the things I'd like to mention about this area and the Paradise Beach Hotel, a very interesting little thing I came across in doing the research about this area. Because in the book I wanted to give people a glimpse of what this area looked like, what were the activities going on in this area. So the Paradise Beach Hotel was originally the Freshwater Club. So persons who know this area know that the water table, and persons who do geography know that you come down on the beach and the water table is fairly close to the surface. So you scratch the sand and you see fresh water, where the fresh water meets the salt water. And we know that happens a lot along the West Coast. So the persons who built the hotel at the time and called it the Freshwater Club. So in 1938, a tourist who was patronizing the club came, and apparently he felt there was no fresh water at the club. So he actually filed a suit against the owners of the Freshwater Club and said there was no fresh water here. And he won the suit. So the hotel then became Paradise Beach Club. So that was one of the interesting things that came out of the research also. How the name, because we all thought it was, maybe the older Barbadians would have known. But I surely didn't know it, and I'm sure a lot of Barbadians did not know.
And that is exactly why these programs are produced, to inform and to educate.
As we enter the main beach section, we have the cemetery which was a cemetery for those victims of cholera in 1854. So one of many burial areas for cholera victims in Barbados at the time. Of course, the cholera epidemic in 1854, and now we are in the midst of another. So it's a good reminder that these things happen and that we all have to be prepared when these things happen. The area has been landscaped and walled, and you know, this happened a few years back when the Rotary took the job of creating a little memorial here for those victims. So it's a nice little oasis here on the beach where people can see some of the history of Barbados and a reminder of that event many, many years ago. As I mentioned earlier, we had this road that led from what most Barbadians will remember, the old road, and it ran along the beach and ended at Fontebelle. And people have to remember this was before we had a deep water harbor, so you could walk the beach. In fact, up until rather recently, we could walk from the old entrance of Bats Rock nearly to Deepwater Harbor. But of course, we know with the development of the Deepwater Harbor, and of course with the change in the coastline, that has been impeded to some extent. But this road was a thoroughfare. And one of the early events that happened along here that is interesting was the 1795 murder of a guy by the name of Augier. Apparently Augier he's described in history as a dancing master. I do believe he may have been someone who was an expert dancer or used to teach people to dance, something, but he was riding his horse and he came up from Spikestown. And apparently when he got into this area here, he was attacked by 2 slaves, was murdered, and his body was hidden in some caves along this area. As we know, this Bats Rock Beach is just at the beach level, and we have a cliff just to the east of us. So, and of course in this limestone structure of Barbados, you know there are cliffs all over this place, and apparently his body was hid in one of the cliffs along here. The road was officially closed at that point. So obviously because it was treacherous. This electricity did not come to Barbados until about 1911, and it didn't spread into this area for maybe another year, 2 years. And of course down here there was no one living in this area, so there was no need for electricity as such. So along this path, along the beach, apparently decided that they would close this road because of this murder. So here we have now, a few hundred years later, 2 murders in 1916, 2 murders of females. One female was struck with a rock. This guy struck her with a rock and killed her. He was freed of the crime. And then there's the Millicent Gittins one. Many of us sang the song at school, Millie Gone to Brazil. We've heard the Merry Men. They've recorded this song. It's a very popular Barbadian folk song. Millicent Gittins was from Westbury in that area. That is where she was born, in that general area. She was 22 years old, and she had a small child who was living with someone else. And we knew her mother was alive also. And we know that she had a sister called Clementina, living in Lightfoot Lane. She worked at the Seelys, who I believe still have property very close to Jordan Supermarket in Fitz Village. She was the living maid of the Seely family, Mabel Seely and Zacchaeus Seely. As you know, Millie had a boyfriend called James Bailey, and they would meet underneath the sandbox tree close to the Seelys and chat, as we know how people, as we say, court. And the particular Friday night, Millicent and James were walking along this road from Fitz Village to go to Bridgetown to visit Millicent's sister who lives in Lightfoot Lane. Now this was Friday night, the 1st of December, 1916. Anyway, on the day of the 30th of November, Millicent and met her sister in Bridgetown. We'll stick a pin at that day. Friday night, Millicent, her boyfriend, and a friend, Mr. Jackman, started this trek coming from Fitz Village to travel through the old Batsrock Road on a moonlit night. There's no electricity in this area, as you know. They didn't come here yet. So, Mr. Jackman decided that when he got to the mile post that is somewhere along before you enter when we talk about the mile post, we know the stone that marks the distance from Bridgetown. He decided he would turn back and go back home, and left Millie and James Bailey to go off to Bridgetown. So somewhere along this road, apparently Millie disappeared because she did not reach Lightfoot Lane. And so here's where the story of the disappearance of Millie starts to emerge. I remember this would have been a fairly heavily wooded area in those days. And it will not be until maybe the second decade of the 20th century that we will see electricity starting to even get down here close to the beach. You had on the escarpment here, you would have had the oil depot, West India Oil Company. They started oil exploration in Barbados, and they were piping oil from St. Thomas down here. And then you had eventually a dairy would appear in the area. And the other activity that would be happening along this area would have been further to the south, where there was still some agricultural activity. And you have the West India rum refinery. There was also a rum refinery to come just in the area where we now know as Walmer Lodge. So those things were on top of the hill or further to the south, and not down here in the general Batsrock area as we know it. So this walk to Bridgetown, apparently Millie did not get to Bridgetown. So the Saturday morning, Millie is not at work. Mabel Seeley looks out the house and she sees Mr. Bailey walking along the street in Fitz Village. So she asks him, well, where's Millie? So Mr. Bailey decides, he said that while they were walking along the beach, a man came up, took Millie's hand, and said he'd taken her to Brazil. So, interesting. And while Mr. Bailey was walking along the street that Saturday morning, he was playing a concertina and singing a funeral hymn. So, he's a very strange fellow, but anyway, this was what Mabel Seeley told the court. And what I would say is that when the investigations started in terms of Millie's disappearance, it was revealed that Millie did have a sister in Brazil. But they were not in any way corresponding. Ms. Seeley said that. But what created the suspicion in the mind of Mabel Seeley was the fact that, and she told Bailey this, but why would she leave and didn't say anything to me? She left her wages here. She left her clothes here. That's not like her. And she was never in correspondence, they said, with the sister in Brazil. So that aroused her suspicion, and she reported the matter to the police. So the police started investigating, and the same, Bailey related the same story to the police, and that was that. Until the Sunday, a physical search now of the area, of the beach area, and at the beach, the police search party found a trail of blood leaving from the beach to a tank, which will be to the east of the beach, on the land side. So this trail of blood led to the tank. So when the police dragged the tank, out came the body of Millicent Gittins. Ironically, so a crowd had gathered by the tank, and among one of the members of that group of spectators was Mr. Bailey. We have the song saying Millie in a well. It was not a well, it was a tank. And the tank because, as I said earlier, there was some dairy farming going on, and they had these tanks for, storing water and stuff like that for the animals. And the area along this stretch, remember, sugar was still prominent, and Spring Garden was a plantation. Prospect was a plantation. So we still had cane fields and some types of agricultural activity going on in the general area. So you had these tanks, so the song speaks to well, but there was no well, it was a tank. And from my understanding, on the property of the old Paradise Beach Hotel, there were some tanks that were still there on the property. Of course, we know that entire structure has been demolished, and we have it replaced with the proposed structure of Four Seasons. But apparently there were some tanks on the old Paradise Beach Hotel property. When the body came out of the tank, Bailey said, "Oh Lord, look, Millie." And the police at that point took hold of him. So you see how this song came about. The whole idea of going to Brazil. But the thing about going to Brazil, the other thing that when the police checked, they realized no boat went to Brazil on that Friday night. A boat went to Venezuela, but not to Brazil. So Bailey's alibi, did not hold a lot of water, and there. I suppose the question is why did this happen, and why did he kill Millie? But he murdered his girlfriend. But his friend Jackman has it says, and this comes from the proceedings of the court. Luckily for this event in Barbadian history, it was written verbatim in the agricultural reporting newspaper. So all of the witnesses who gave evidence before the court were beautifully recorded in the pages of the newspaper. So we can see them, live, so to speak, giving their evidence before the court. And of course, you had all of these witnesses who saw him with her, who would normally see him going along here. There was a little village called Winters Village, which has disappeared. He would now pass through the Winters Village on the way to Bridgetown. There was the evidence of him going to a lady's house and asking for a piece of wire. So there was the wire around Millie's waist, or wrapping her up, so to be tied up with the wire, put her in the tank, and he used a large stone as a weight, so to speak. So you had these bits of evidence that connected him to Millie. And of course, his main alibi of Millie going to Brazil clearly was You know, and just not the case because no boat, no ship had left for Brazil. Mr. Bailey was sentenced to hang. But again, in those days, normally you had just a short time to appeal. And of course, we can say that this was a fairly clear-cut case to some extent. Maybe it would have been, with the way we do things today, of course, you may have had you know, a much more strenuous argument on behalf of Mr. Bailey. But at the trial, his lawyer didn't really seem to, you know, feel that he had much of a chance. The only glimpse that we got, that we can get into the thinking of James Bailey, is from Jackman himself. When Jackman says that at some point, some conversations between himself and Bailey, that it seemed that Bailey was jealous of someone, another man, but we don't have any evidence of that. He said this man was from Station Hill, but no names were mentioned, so we don't know. So it's difficult to say that yes, Bailey was friendly with someone else because no names were mentioned. But at one point, Bailey apparently made statements pointing to violence towards Bailey. So we have that also coming out in the evidence before the court, and Jackman would reveal these things. Unfortunately, well, Bailey, the last words we have from Bailey is, "Oh Lord, look Millie." He did not say anything after that. It's not recorded that he said anything after that. He did not say anything in the court at all. He was silent for the rest of this episode.
Well, his silence during the trial and the few words uttered at the crime scene inspired the writing of the song Millie Gone to Brazil, a folk song that acts as a reminder of that movement of Barbadian people to this South American country in the early 20th century.
This song, Millie Gone to Brazil, this was critical, really. You have to consider this song was critical in preserving the memory of that Barbadian group. And I must say, a rather vibrant group of people who are still there, who still carry English names. They still remember that they have a connection to Barbados. Having visited them, I know they're very proud to have the Barbadian connection. And some have visited. And there's even more interest now that after I did the thesis and I was doing the research and everything, it's creating even more interest among the Barbadians in Brazil.
And may that interest in the research continue. Well, the next time you sing the folk song Millie Gone to Brazil, perhaps you would want to take some time and consider the life of Millicent Gittins. Millie did not go to Brazil. Unfortunately, Millie was murdered here on Bax Rock Beach. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. This has been Mind Community. Until next week at the same time, every blessing.